It's the swinging 60s. The baby boomers have come of age and they're throwing out the shackles in the sexual revolution. During this time in Canberra, camp men and women were beginning to find their place, and by the end of the decade, law reform was on the horizon. This is part 2 of a multi-part series exploring the queer history of the nation's capital, from closeted public servants in the 50s and 60s to intersex law reforms in the 2020s. So please join me as we explore Canberra's queer past in living in the GAYCT. By 1960, Canberra's population had reached 50,000, 30,000 more than the decade before. Despite this rapid increase in population, Canberra was still small enough for everyone to know each other's business, with few places to socialise. Common stomping grounds for the queer community were the Rex, Ainsley and Civic hotels. On a Friday night, you would regularly see camp men meeting up at one of these bars, having a quiet beer with each other, right up the back to avoid the ockers. But this wasn't without incident. In autumn 1962, biochemist Dr Alfred Gottschalk attended the Rex and caught the attention of a young labourer, Alan Donnelly. After a quick chat, they decided to head back to Dr Gottschalk's flat. But a short time later, the doctor was found bloodied, dazed and on the street without his pants. And it's at this point their stories diverge, as the police gathered 2 different stories. The doctor said that he was held at knife point, told to remove his pants and forced to hand over money. While Donnelly said that he was propositioned and attacked the doctor in self-defense and denied any theft of money. Donnelly was charged with assault, but in court it was Dr Gottschalk who was questioned over an indecency charge. Likely heavily embarrassed, he failed to show up to court the following day after an attempted overdose on sleeping pills. A week later, Dr Gottschalk returned to court to face further scrutiny of past liaisons with men and the evidence provided to the court. All of this did not end well. Donnelly was acquitted from the assault charge, even though he admitted to assaulting Dr Gottschalk. Most likely because the judge believed that any reasonable straight man would fly into a rage if another man hit on him. What we would call today the homosexual panic defense. A couple of months later, Dr Gottschalk returned to Germany. After all, his name was all through the local newspapers and it would have been a hot topic of gossip. In Canberra, you could find camp men in all sorts of positions of power, including Grant McIntyre, who was friends with former Prime Minister Harold Holt and was even his private secretary while he was Immigration Minister. Holt had met McIntyre in high school, and the two were close friends until Holt's disappearance in 1967. McIntyre was a flamboyant man who regularly hosts soirees for all the camp men, though his cooking was questionable and he was prone to overpouring his G&Ts. He was a true professional, keeping his camp and working lives separate, but his connection to Harold Holt wasn't without its benefits. One time at a gay bar in Sydney, local police came in for a protection bribe. The publican introduced them to McIntyre as Holt's personal secretary, and the officers vanished in an instant. Loyal to a fault, McIntyre was well connected to political and cultural circles. Though Asio and his colleagues most certainly knew that he was gay, they all chose the policy of don't ask, don't tell. Don't ask, don't tell was a policy followed by paralibrarians who moved here in the late 1950s. Wendy and Donnie, not their real names, moved here in 1958 to work in the local libraries. Because it was a struggle to convince staff to move to Canberra, Wendy was in a position to negotiate, securing herself a 2-bedroom flat to share with her partner. This allowed them to live together with plausible deniability. For Donnie, it was important for them to be discreet, as her department was extremely conservative. But as time went on, both Wendy and Donnie found more queer people to socialise with, through work and sport. Their social lives revolved around the cinema and theatre, dinner parties and picnics, and having a drink at the Rex Hotel. The Rex in particular was known to regularly have same-sex couples dancing with each other. And when it came to official events, Wendy would often invite one of her male friends, either gay or straight, to act as her beard. Of course, with Sydney's proximity, Wendy and other queer people took regular trips to King's Cross and Oxford Street to enjoy the gay scene, which offered them a level of anonymity unavailable in Canberra. Camp life in Canberra wasn't always nude photo shoots and soirees. The law was a heavy presence that impacted the gay men of the city, but one midnight hookup was going to change that forever. On a chilly night in early 1969, Brian went cruising in Garema Place. There he met a handsome chap by the name of Walter. They went for a drive to a secluded dirt road near Awani Golf Course. They parked and were about to play when the lights of a cop car blared through the rear window. Startled, they jumped up and Brian got out of the car, facing the cops with his pants around his feet and standing to attention, according to the official report. Both of them were taken in for questioning and charged with indecent assault. On the 1st of April, both men faced court, with Brian being sent to the Supreme Court and Walter being dismissed as he never admitted to anything. On the 13th of May, Brian was found guilty by a jury of 7 men and 5 women. The judge sentenced him to 6 months hard labour in the notorious Cooma jail, and that authorities should give any possible medical treatment to cure his homosexuality. When it comes to convictions, gay men would often admit guilt to lessen their sentence or to avoid a public trial. But Brian's case was different. He chose to plead not guilty and to take his case to the High Court. The sentence of hard labour was an unusual and extreme one for this kind of crime. His lawyer, Michael Landale, stated in the evidence given in court that there was no assault in the usual sense of the word. Like, how can you consent to mutual assault? Landale had hoped that this case in the High Court would have been enough to repeal the indecent assault against male law, but 2 justices dismissed Brian's case, and poor Brian was shipped off to jail. Though this is the last time we hear of Brian in this story, his case was the catalyst for legal reform in the ACT. Internationally, this was a time of great change for gay rights. The UK decriminalised homosexuality in 1967, which Michael Landale was there to witness. And of course, the Stonewall riots happened in June in 1969 in New York, while Brian was being convicted. Sprinkled through the law reports of the Canberra Times, Brian's case drew the attention of Thomas Mortner, a philosophy lecturer at the ANU. Through chatting with friends, he was eventually introduced to Michael Landale. A short time later, both men met up with journalist Peter Sekulis as they decided to take on the mantle of homosexual law reform. The next day, the meeting was published on the front page of the Canberra Times. In this unassuming side street, now surrounded by tall buildings, is the birthplace of the gay rights movement here in Australia. Or at the very least, where the first organisation took up the fight for gay rights reform. The world of homosexual politics had arrived, and Canberra was its origin point. It was here in this building behind me, the Red Cross House, on the 27th of July 1969, that the Homosexual Law Reform Society was created. 30 people met here to establish its aims and to elect a committee to draft an ordinance to repeal the ban on homosexuality. The ACT was governed under New South Wales law still, but could be amended by the relevant federal minister. This is who the ordinance was for. What makes the Homosexual Law Reform Society so interesting is that it wasn't led or run by gay people. Not that we're aware of anyway. It was just run by a bunch of straight people who felt the law was unfair and they wanted to change it. They believed that in a modern enlightened world, the law should not discriminate, be irrational or unjust. By mid-October 1969, after consulting the British legislation, medical journals and public surveys, the homosexual law reform had come up with a proposed ordinance to decriminalise homosexuality. To achieve change, the Homosexual Law Reform Society used a lot of tactics that we still use today, from meeting with and lobbying politicians, including Gough Whitlam, and conducting public surveys. They actually found out that Canberra had a higher approval rating at 68% compared to the national average at 22%. They also regularly published articles and letters in the Canberra Times. Their work and the idea of decriminalisation drew the attention of sympathetic journalists from the Canberra Times, the Australian, if you can believe it, and the Age. These reports also inspired people around the country to organise in their own cities. Though inspired to act by Brian's trial, the tabling of the draft criminal code for the ACT by the Federal Attorney General is what gave the society purpose. The draft criminal code was meant to modernise the law around homosexuality, abortion and suicide. A noble cause for sure, but it was written so vaguely that the suggestion of sexual acts against nature could actually criminalise heterosexual and lesbian acts, which ran in total contradiction of a liberal society. But homosexual politics and liberalism at the time had its limits. The 1960s may have been swinging, but the 1970s got radical. Thank you so much for watching part 2 of Living in the GAYCT. If you want more queer history in the meantime, I strongly recommend checking out the Queers Past podcast or the book Acting Out by Graham Willett. If you've enjoyed this video, feel free to like, comment and share. And if you don't want to miss part 3, make sure you hit the subscribe button.